Okay, let's make a start now. So thank you for joining me for this webinar. So this morning we're going to be looking at certifying medical software. And I think we can all recognize this is something where there's an increased recognition of the significance of medical software in solving some of society's problems. Obviously, the current one are the focus of everyone's mind, but many others as well that those of us who work in the field of digital health have been talking about for a long time. Um, I think there's a growing interest in opportunities to develop solutions around remote, really any kind of remote diagnostics, monitoring or treatment. There's also a growing interest in artificial intelligence, in kind of data-centric solutions, anything that involves decision support, and many others as well. So this is very much a growing field. And if you're involved in this field, you'll be aware that the regulations are quite complex. They make quite large demands, and it can be a bit of a complex task, kind of cutting your way through the jungle, as it were. So hopefully this morning I'll give you a few pointers that will help you on your way. But before we get into the detail of that, let's just consider for a moment. Actually, why do we need regulations anyway? And let's take a current example. So supposing I was to develop an app that was able to tell whether you had coronavirus or not, whether you had COVID-19. And obviously that would be amazing. Obviously that would have a huge impact on countries' responses. It would be, as our government likes to say, a game changer. But imagine that I developed an app that claimed to detect COVID-19, but was actually just a random number generator. So you could imagine inventing something, right? That maybe you spoke into the phone, and maybe you placed your finger over the camera to detect something, but actually all it was doing was just allocating a random diagnosis. Just think about how harmful that would be. So obviously you would have some people who tested positive. You told them they had the disease, but they didn't, and they would self-isolate, presumably, maybe with their family as well. They might make demands on the medical resources, testing and such like, and clearly there's an emotional impact to that. But actually the inverse is worse. So if you were given a false sense of security by an app like that, and decided to continue with your life and ignore social distancing, you would be potentially a source of infection, which could have very serious consequences. So the medical device regulations are the reason why that's not legal. I mean, you may argue there are other regulations as well in my slightly extreme example, but sadly that's not all that far-fetched given some of the cases we've seen in the past. And so it is the medical device regulations that ultimately would allow the authorities to insist on such an app being removed from the stores, although historically that's taken quite a long time to achieve in a few cases. Perhaps it would be faster in my example. But also it would be a means by which the authorities could prosecute you if you did that. And I don't suggest you do. Now, clearly, there are different jurisdictions in force across the world. So this morning, I'm going to consider the EU primarily, but we should also be aware of the fact that other countries have other regulatory regimes in place. In particular, in the US, the FDA administers the equivalent regulations. And most other countries, well, many other countries have equivalent regulations that follow the same sorts of principles. Obviously, there are countries where there's very little in the way of regulation as well. But really, if you're aware of the EU and the FDA regimes, you could consider them to be the kind of gold standard, and compliance in other countries would be equivalent or simpler. It's probably also worth considering that as far as software is concerned, and I think particularly as far as apps are concerned, The EU and the FDA are going in slightly different directions, in fact, in opposite directions. The EU is introducing new legislation, which we'll discuss in a few minutes, which is actually raising the bar as far as compliance is concerned, particularly for software. The FDA, on the other hand, have, through a series of guidance notes that they've issued over recent years, somewhat lowered the bar, particularly as far as apps are concerned, or at least clarified the position. So it'll be interesting to see how that develops in coming years. So in the EU, and for the purposes of our conversation, let's assume that includes the UK. As far as we know, the UK will continue to maintain this legislation post-Brexit. Currently, the regulation in force is the Medical Device Directive, and that is shortly to be replaced by the Medical Device Regulations. In fact, it was to be replaced in a few days, but has now been delayed for a year. And it's quite significant, the changes between the two. So we're going to drill into a bit more detail about what these regulations actually mean if you're developing medical software. But I wanted to point out that the points that I'm raising in this presentation, many of them could justify an entire presentation in their own right. So I'm really going to skim over the surface. And if you need more detail, then hopefully this will give you a bit of a framework from which you can sort of dip into other guidance. And it'll give you a bit of a sort of landscape, but it's not a complete guide. Obviously, we'd be here for a very long time if that was the case. So as far as I'm going to look at the NDR definition of a medical device, because that's the future. And this is from the regulation, and this defines what they mean by a medical device. It's worth probably just picking out a few words from here. You'll notice that the word software specifically is included in the top paragraph. And I think it's also worth noting the use of words like monitoring, which I think is often where developers have some false hope. It's not unknown for me to hear people say that they don't believe they're a medical device because they're just monitoring some parameters. Now, it would be sort of true if you were literally just taking a reading from one place to another. For example, medical record systems are not considered medical devices because they only move data around, they don't manipulate it. But if you are doing any kind of processing, and a very common scenario might be a kind of IoT solution where you've got a physical device that is connected to an app and the phone is acting as a hub, or where you've developed an app which is a standalone, but it does some processing of the data that it gathers, perhaps from the onboard sensors or just from data entered. So all of those things would probably fall into the category of a medical device. So the scope is very broad. It doesn't leave a huge amount of scope for software that has some medical purpose to not be considered a medical device. So if you've looked at these regulations and you decided, okay, I am going to be developing a medical device, then the next thing you need to ask yourself is, what class of medical device am I developing? And I've borrowed this slide from a publication from the MHRA, the UK body that's responsible for administering the regulations. And so the examples that they've given are all physical devices, although some of them might have software involved in them. But you can see the principle is that we start with class 1 as the lowest risk, and we move our way through to class 3 as the highest risk. Class 3 would be something where there is a significant impact of failure might readily involve death. Class 1, something where failure might involve some mild inconvenience, but is unlikely to have any more serious impact than that. And in fact, the way that you decide what class of medical device you are developing is governed by a whole series of rules. And I'm not going to go through those rules now in any detail, but I am just going to pick on one of them, which is Rule 11. Rule 11 is specifically about software. This is new in the MDR. So you'll notice that this opening sentence here, software intended to provide information which is used to take decisions with diagnosis or therapeutic purpose, is classified as Class 2A. Now, it's actually quite hard to think of an example of software which might be considered a medical device according to the representation we looked at a few minutes ago, the rules we looked at a few minutes ago, but which doesn't have some diagnostic or therapeutic purpose. So it seems that by introducing these new regulations, the MDR has effectively made Class 1 a closed door as far as software developers are concerned. It's unlikely, if you are involved in medical device software, that in future you will be a Class 1 device. And if you're listening to this and you think, I can think of an example, then please do let me know. And to date, under the MDD, most standalone software, certainly the vast majority of apps, have been able to consider themselves Class 1. Now that's important because, just pop back to the definitions again, Class 1 device can be self-certified. So all you have to do is pull together the evidence to show that you have complied with the regulations, submit that evidence to, in the UK, the MHRA, and assuming they agree, then you can add the CE marking to your device. You will be a medical device, a Class 1 medical device. For a Class 2 device, you have to go through that process as what's called a notified body. So they are the organizations that have been approved by the EU as auditors, in effect. And so obviously that's a harder process. There is more checking going on when an audit is conducted by a notified body. And actually, to make life more complicated, the MDD introduces a whole load of new rules about notified bodies as well. And many of the notified bodies are going through the process of achieving compliance. So there's actually quite a shortage of notified bodies that are capable of approving your device under the MDR. So it's fortunate that we've been given an extra year. But at the moment, if you went to a notified body and says, "Well, I've developed this solution and I'd like you to review it as my notified body, please," they will probably say, "Well, please come back in about a year's time," because that's what the waiting lists are like. Now, there is a little bit of a get-out clause, because if you were to consider yourself Class 1 under the MDD, you could release your product going through the Class 1 process. And then when the new Act comes into force in May of 21, you have a bit of a, you don't have to immediately recertify, but you do have to recertify if you release a new version of your product. So it's actually only quite a small caveat. And let's also remind ourselves of this final bullet point here, 2B, applies if your device, your medical software, could lead to a serious deterioration in this person's state of health. And actually, that's not as uncommon as you might think. So there are a number of products on the market today which are currently Class 1, which will become Class 2B with all the additional sort of checks and balances that go with that. So let's suppose then that you have decided that you're developing a medical device, you've reviewed the regulations, and you've decided what class of medical device you are developing. So how do you get certified? And let's just pause for a moment. I included this picture, which is Helen Carruthers, who is completing in dramatic fashion the London Marathon last year, 2019, just to illustrate the fact that actually certification is a marathon, not a sprint. It is a long haul. It is quite complicated. Well, I suppose complicated, but achievable. It's not as if this was an unattainable goal. There are implications, and you need to take it seriously. But completing a marathon it is achievable for many, many people, and so is certifying a medical device. So the short answer to the question, how do I get certified, is you create a technical file. And the technical file is really the summary of the body of evidence that you've followed the regulations, complied with the regulations. And so for the remainder of this presentation, what we're going to do is drill into what you need to do and what you need to include in your technical file to demonstrate that. And I think it's worth saying that in some senses, it's not so much the device itself which is being certified as the organization that is producing the device. So what the notified bodies, or what the regulations are seeking to do, is to demonstrate that the organization producing the medical device is capable of and has followed the requirements of the regulation. So you should think about this as an organizational thing rather than just a kind of side deal that goes on that particular product if you have others that you develop. So one of the ways to, or one of the ways that the regulations talk about compliance is to look at what is the state of the art. So what they want you to do is to show that you have done a good job, if you like, so that you followed the state of the art in terms of how things are done. Pause for a moment because somebody's come to my door and I can't do anything about that. I'm going to just mute for a second. Okay, apologies for the interruption. The joys of home working. Right, so following the state of the art. How would you know whether you're following the state of the art? Well, the answer is you would look at the international standards that apply. So there are 4 that really you should be aware of if you're developing medical software. The first one, 13485, applies to all medical devices and not specific to software. 14971 again applies to all medical devices, but specifically looks at how you manage risk. And really risk is the central underpinning of the standards. And then 62304 and 82304 are very similar, but they consider the 2 different cases. One where your software is part of a wider medical device that involves some physical product as well. And then the other where you are just completely standalone software, as for example, with an app. You would typically be standalone. So we're going to look at those in more detail. If you are to comply with the regulations, you really are going to need a quality management system. So a documented framework that describes the policies and processes that apply, describing how things are done in your organization. And the first thing that you really would want to have in a quality management system, I think, is to have some sort of top-level commitment, so some sort of management commitment to quality at an organizational level. And you might evidence that through things like minutes in the monthly management meeting or at the board or whatever, to demonstrate that quality is considered and discussed at all levels of the organization. You're also going to need a document management system, and that's important because you need to be able to demonstrate that a given document was agreed and approved and accepted as part of the organizational records at a given point in time. So your document management system would need to talk about things like approval of documents, where they're stored, how you access them, how you identify them, what numbering system you have for your documents, and probably what you do in terms of archival as well, so when a document is no longer relevant. you'll need a training policy. And that's really because you need to show that your staff know how to use your quality management system and they know the importance of compliance. And actually, that's not just your staff, but if you use subcontractors, you would need to demonstrate the same thing, either that they comply to their own internal policies and you've audited those policies and demonstrated that they're sufficient, or that they are complying with your policies, in which case you obviously would need to have some sort of training record to prove that you've told them what your quality system is. You'll need a risk management process. As I've said, risk management is a really underpinning part of standards. And we're going to drill into that in a bit more detail in a moment. You'll need, as a software developer, you'll clearly need a development process. Again, we'll drill into that in a bit more detail in a moment. You'll need some sort of post-market surveillance process. So that's describing how you manage your product once it's in service, it's available in the market, and in particular, what you would do if somebody complained about your product. If they submitted what's called an adverse or notification of an adverse event. So particularly if somebody was harmed by your product in some way or claimed to have been harmed by your product in some way, what would you do to address that concern and make sure that you made the necessary modifications if it was a genuine issue? But more widely, it's, I think, important to understand how effective your product is and what impact it's having, and to build the evidence base. We'll talk about evidence as well. And then finally, in your QMS, you're going to need some sort of process for continuous improvement. And again, this is really important. I think often the auditors will look at this almost more than anything else, because they would live with some minor deviations in the rest of the system, providing you can demonstrate that you have a system for improvement that means that issues get identified and then tracked through to resolution. And sometimes that's described as a CAPA, a corrective and protective action process, which would register the fact that some issue had been identified, either a corrective one, something has gone wrong and we're going to fix it, or a preventative one, we think something might go wrong, so we're going to take some action before it does. And you would track through what actions resulted from your CAPA and then how you closed it. So with your QMS in place, you then need to look at more specific issues around your product. So some pointers from 13485. So you need to define the intended use of your device. Now, this is really important. The way that you describe how you intend your device or software to be used can have quite a big impact on where you fall in terms of the classes. So it's possible to word your intended use in such a way as to land in a class 1 definition or to land in a class 2A or even 2B definition. So thinking about the intended use of your device is really important. And of course, that has to reflect what your ambitions are in terms of market penetration and the value that you intend to bring. Often it's the case that the wider you write your intended use, the more implications there are in terms of compliance, but also the broader the potential market that you can address. So software identification is really important, product identification. The regulations, particularly the MDR, talk about something called UDI. So it's like a unique identification number for your product. And they talk about two different parts to that UDI. So there's what they call the device identification and the product identifier. Device identifier and product identifier. The the device identifier being the, if you like, the product code, so the class of device, class of release that you have developed, and the other being the stock number, so the actual sort of manufacturing instance of that device. Now, in software, that doesn't really translate. We don't tend to track the actual installation of a piece of software. You might, I suppose, for example, with an app, you might track the IMEI and the user registration account. But it's not really quite the same. So my advice really here is that the release note is your friend. When you release your software, if you produce a release note, that can be the thing that identifies that release, and that is the code that goes with it. However you decide to do your release numbering, that's your device identifier. And because a release note can be a controlled document in your document management system, you can demonstrate that it went through an approval process, so it was released in a controlled way. You can include in your release note things like the evidence that the testing was done to satisfy the verification requirements, and so on and so forth. So the release note is really important. And then last bullet point here, gather evidence that it works and is safe. So again, this is really important. You need to demonstrate some sort of clinical robustness, something that proves that your product actually does what you said the intended use was, and it delivers the benefits that you're claiming for it. Now, that doesn't necessarily have to be a full-blown randomized controlled trial. It can just be a pilot. But you need to gather some evidence from that. And often how you do that is by looking at equivalence. So if you can demonstrate that your product is at least as good as some other product that's already on the market and certified, that it performs at least as well and hopefully better, then you have satisfied the requirements for clinical effect. So what the 14971 risk management process has you do is to think about identifying the risks associated with your product. And you can do that in any way you like, really. So you could have workshops, you could have people submit ideas. So long as you capture the risks and you track them, that's all you need to do. And you can obviously tie that to your post-market surveillance process post-release. Once you've identified your risks, you then need to consider what is the potential for harm. And so that can range from mild inconvenience all the way through to death in the case of a medical device. And then once you've assessed the potential for harm, you would also consider how likely that is to occur. And you don't necessarily, you need to apply common sense in following this process. So it is often possible to imagine a scenario in which even the most benign piece of software could result in serious harm. But if the likelihood of that is extraordinarily low, you can probably discount that from any further consideration. And what you aim to do is to end up with a little matrix like this. So you place your risks on the matrix. Clearly, if a risk is in the green zone, then you don't need to worry about it too much. If it's in the yellow zone, then you would probably want to look to see how you could mitigate it. And if it's in the red zone, you might well say, actually, we can't release our product while we have risks in the red zone. We need to find ways to mitigate those before we release. So mitigations, you then need to look at ways to reduce the harm, particularly for your highest priority risks. And that can be in a number of different ways, but the best way to mitigate a harm would be by design. So if you can design your software in such a way that the risk is removed, that the threat or the harm cannot occur, then you have mitigated that risk more or less to zero. You could also consider what they call labeling. And in the context of medical device software, labeling really means anything to do with the UI. So the way in which your fields are named, the way in which tooltips are displayed, the way in which forms are arranged. These can all be used to mitigate risk of harm. If misuse could lead to harm, you can look at ways of designing your UI to avoid misuse. Now, it's fair to say that labeling is a less effective solution than out-and-out design. Simply telling somebody not to do something because it might be risky for them is not as good as making it impossible for them to do that. But labeling can be an appropriate solution in the right circumstances. So having identified your mitigations, you then need to consider whether applying your mitigations has introduced any new risks. And if it has, you obviously have to cycle around the process again. And then the final step is to assess whether the benefits of your product outweigh the potential for harm. So the regulations don't say that you have to remove the risk of harm altogether. They simply say that you must show that benefits of your device being on the market is greater than any potential harm that may be caused. And if you think back to what I said about clinical evaluation, so your clinical evaluation should prove that the benefits are indeed greater than, or at least they are what you said they were. And if you think back again to the intended use, so you're demonstrating that your intended use has a benefit, you could prove it through the clinical evaluation, and you can demonstrate that the risks, potential for harm, have been mitigated. So the final set of standards to think about, you'll be pleased to know, are the development standards. So 62304 and 82304. Remember, 62304 is software associated with a physical device. 82304 is software that is standalone. As I say, they broadly speaking say the same things. And they're really focused on the life cycle, the development life cycle. They don't dictate a particular life cycle or methodology. So you can develop software in a waterfall method and be compliant with the regulations, or you can use an agile Scrum style process and still be compliant with the regulations. There's really no weighting given to one or the other. But what you do have to show is that your development process is done in a controlled way. I mean, I've illustrated this with an iterative process that might be more applicable to Agile, which I think most people would probably gravitate towards these days. And you would want to show, you would need to show in your processes, your development process, remember we talked about policy management system earlier, you would need to show in your process that development was done in a planned way. So it wasn't just a kind of ad hoc, chaotic process where people developed whatever they felt like, and then anytime we felt like it, we threw out a release. But rather, requirements were selected, releases were planned, timescales were evaluated, the process was monitored and done in an effective way, and that the results were reviewed, and again, you have that continuous improvement process. You would need to show that you gave some thought to the requirements that you chose to address. And by that, I mean, ideally, that you can show that there is some reason why you've chosen the requirements that you've chosen. So that might be that you've done some research, perhaps you've talked to some users, or you've looked at some data from your existing product and how it's being used, or you've looked at some other existing product and how it can be improved upon. But some sort of analysis that shows that a requirement has a reason to exist, that it's not just made up. And again, think back to intended use and clinical evaluation. So does the requirement fit your intended use? And can you demonstrate that the requirement, if implemented, will have a clinical benefit? So those kinds of analysis are really important to demonstrate. And obviously, you would need some kind of tracking system with your requirements. So they need to be written down. It doesn't matter how they're written down. They don't have to comply with a certain format. So you may write user stories, or you may write use cases, or you may just write requirements. It doesn't really matter, but they do need to be documented. And obviously, requirements could also arise from your risk management. So it could be that you've done a risk assessment and you've said the mitigation is we're going to do this, and therefore that becomes a requirement. So once you've written your requirements, you then want to consider that there's a process by which you design your solution. And that can be the sort of architectural software design, but also the UI design, as I mentioned. Labeling is very important. And it's vital, actually, that you don't make a claim in the way that you have implemented your app that isn't in line with your intended use. You will need to demonstrate a process for verification. And I want to just clarify for a moment the difference between verification and validation. So verification, I like to say, is have we built the product right? And validation is, have we built the right product? So by that I mean, verification is looking at, have we built the product right? Have we gone through the right process? Can we show that what we've got at the end of our development process is what we wanted at the start? And classically, the way you do that is to look at traceability. So I would recommend that you find some way in which you can demonstrate that your requirements trace to your test plan and test scenarios. And then you know that the tests you've performed prove that the requirements have been implemented. And ideally, although this isn't really a requirement of the standards, I think best practice would be to show some sort of traceability from your requirements to your code base. And ultimately, I think what you're trying to demonstrate is that the software does exactly what the requirements say it should do, and only what the requirements say it should do. And so if you can show that you've a process for achieving that, then you're good. It's also important, as I've mentioned, configuration control here. It's very important that you have some process to know exactly what code was built into a given release. And so classic software version control system is important here because it will help you to identify the specific version of each, or the specific state of each of your code bases as they're built in, but also consider things like libraries and SDKs and other dependencies. And that can get really complicated. But strictly speaking, you would need to demonstrate that you knew exactly which version of all of those things went into a version of your software. And again, this is where release notes can be really useful. And finally, of course, problem resolution, so bug fixing. You'll need some process in place to identify bugs and to track them through to resolutions. It's not just about feature development. You need to consider the whole picture as far as software development is concerned. Okay, so final few thoughts from me. So this might seem quite daunting. I think it's certainly a a significant commitment to comply with all of these regulations. But I would also put it to you that, again, considering that point about the state of the art, this is really just how software should be developed in all cases. This is the way we do it. This is the best way we know how to do it. And ultimately, actually, doing it this way is cheapest. I know that may seem contradictory, but if you consider the whole life cycle of an application, and assuming that you're developing something that you expect to be around for some length of time, the longer software is in service, the more difficult it is to maintain. The better it is written in the first place, and the better it's being maintained, the cheaper that cost is. So there is some evidence to suggest that applying quality standards actually does lead to the lowest overall cost of ownership. But in any case, we should want, I think, if we are developing serious software that has medical purpose, we should want it to be developed to a high standard. We should not find this particularly onerous. Clearly, you might quibble with some of the regulations. You may think that they're inappropriate, but as a general principle, it seems right that there should be some regulation of this. So my recommendations are that you should aim to start early. It's much easier to comply with the regulations if you consider that from day one of your project, rather than try and bolt something on at the end. The earlier you start, the better. And if you think back to that intended use again, getting that right and getting your requirements right and lined up with your intended use is something you may well do right at the start of the process before you've even written a line of code. I would also say don't over-engineer. I think it's quite common for people who are not that familiar with the regulations and the general processes of compliance to overdo some of their responses. I would say common sense should apply. Um, so if you find yourself doing something that doesn't make sense logically or rationally, just because you think that's what the regulations are telling you to do, the chances are you've not understood the regulations properly. So common sense should apply, and best practice, or at least historical precedent, is always a really good guide. It is worth getting help. I think this is not a trivial undertaking, as we've said, and there are people out there who've been through that process before, who can help you and may well save you quite a bit of time and cost by pointing you in the right direction. And my final thought is that actually, this is a great thing to have done when you've done it. A lot of your competitors may well not have done. So once you have achieved certification and you can put that CE marking on your product, you will find that you have a much better access to a number of markets. You will find that you have erected a barrier to your competition who may be trying to follow you, because they clearly will have to go through that same process. So it gives you a place from which to exploit the investment that you've made. So that is my guide to certification of medical software. Now, we've still got a few minutes left in the time allocated, and I can see that I've had a question here already, but I'm just going to answer that question in a moment. While I'm doing that, please have a think and post any other questions that you might have as a result of what you said, or just generally on the subject of certification. So the question is, are there any different considerations for AI products that we should be aware of? And that's a really good question. I think the regulators themselves are struggling with this a bit. The problem with AI is, if you think back to my comment that you should demonstrate that the software does what the requirements say and only what the requirements say, that's a bit harder with AI, because by definition, it is well, it depends what type of AI we're talking about, but if it's machine learning, then by definition it is learning, it is evolving, it is changing. And if you also think about the points that I made about configuration control, and the fact that you need to know exactly what version of your product was released and what went into that release. That again is harder to do with something which is a bit more dynamic. But what I think is important is that in general, you should try and apply the same principles. But specifically, I think the issue of configuration control becomes more important. So often with AI, there is a process of training a model, which is then deployed. And so you want to have evidence that the version of the model that was released is one which you have trained and verified or validated. And then any change that is part of the dynamics of that system are not really part of configuration control, they're part of the system in operation. So you can draw a line perhaps between what is configuration controlled and demonstrate that that is under control, and what is your AI product and it working within the constraints of your definition, and then demonstrate that the risks outweigh the benefits. So you might consider what is the potential for harm if my AI behaves in a different way to the way that I think it's going to, and how do I mitigate to show that even if it does do that, the risk of harm is mitigated or reduced. So I hope that speaks to some of the the issues around AI. I mean, it's very much an emerging field, and there's a lot of debate about how to do that. Wonder if anyone else has any questions. If you do, you should be able to post them online to me now. I'll certainly leave the session open whilst you do that. Obviously, if you're facing this as a challenge for your business, we at 500 and More would be interested to talk to you. We develop software. We develop purposeful software. That's our mission statement. So purposeful software often is medical in our case. And so we're very much interested in this work and have some experience. So I've had a question now from, so it says, ISO standards define questions that must be asked, but are there consortia organizations that give clear definitions of processes for risk management, for example? So that's a great question. Now there are obviously bodies of various sizes that will help you with your compliance. So organizations like BSI, for example, and many others. And some of those have provided some sort of online resources to help. I would say that they will charge for their time, so you know they will be happy to help. They will want recompense for that. There is a framework which unfortunately the name of which has eluded me for a moment, but I will happily post you the information after the session. There is a framework which defines what your technical file should consist of. It's not part of the regulations, and it's not specific to any jurisdiction, but it provides a guidance for what is generally accepted as the right things to put into a technical file. So that will give you some guidance as well. I think there is a little bit of commercial sensitivity around this, in that any organization that thought that it had a fantastic solution to risk management, they will want to keep that under their for their clients. So there's a limit, I think, to what's publicly available. So I hope that gives a little bit of answer to your question. Any other questions anyone would like to ask? So just to go back to the point I was making about the timescales, the NDR will now come into effect in May of 2021. So you have 12 months to resolve the issues that bring. I think we're seeing an improvement in the situation with the notified bodies and a reduction in the timescales. So hopefully, as we get through this next 12 months, timescales will come down. But it is still a challenge. I think anyone who is looking to release a medical device is facing a bit of a challenge. And it's also, I think, perhaps interesting just to think about, if you have a device that you think is going to be really useful for current crisis, clearly the government is, if you have something that is genuinely useful, the government is not going to want your device to be stuck awaiting certification before it can be used. So now might be, if you're in that position, particularly if you've been able to sort of get any government funding for anything you're doing, and I guess this applies to all jurisdictions, you would, I think you'd be in a good place to use that as a lever to try and understand if there are, what's the fastest way, I suppose, to get through certification. Not, of course, that you can avoid the regulations, and nor should you, but certainly there would be a lot of willingness to help, I suppose, from everyone, including the MHRA. And generally, the MHRA are very good. If you have questions, you can talk to them, and they will do their best to answer. They want organisations to be able to get through this process. They're not necessarily blocking it. Okay, very good. So I'll just wait a couple more minutes in case there are any more questions. I see we have one at that point. So the question is software that's used as a plugin in packs, for instance, considered as standalone software or not? Okay, so that's a really interesting question, and I guess it depends on the context a little bit more. So the definition of standalone software is something which will run on a, shall we say, a standard computer hardware. So that could be a Windows desktop or a mobile phone, or something that is generally or generically commercially available. I guess I should say Mac as well, in case you're from an Apple camp. So if you've got software that is running on any of those kinds of devices, it's clearly standalone. If your software is running on a bespoke device, it's clearly not standalone, so you would apply the 6304. There's a kind of a grey area, I guess, in that there are cases of hardware which it's not exactly generically available, but it's perhaps an open source, or there are open interfaces which allow you to develop software as a separate organization, and then that can be deployed on that device. And I think ultimately that the final decision rests with who owns the certification. So if you consider the scenario where you've got a piece of hardware and it's got some software running on it, if that is sold as a complete solution, then clearly there can only be one person. There's one organization that owns the certification of that solution and markets it. If you can buy those two things separately from two different organizations, they both need to have certification. So ultimately, it really depends on who takes responsibility for saying that this is a certified device. Great, good. So last few minutes, if anyone has any other questions, I hope that's been helpful. I will attempt to reach out to you over the next couple of days. And so if you've got any more questions you want to ask me, please do. And if you've got a project, I just realized that I've been doing this and I can click to say that I have answered them, and then I believe you will see the questions. So I will just do that. Yes, so if you've got any more specific questions that you would like to ask me afterwards, then please do. And so another question here, which I'm going to answer: are there any specific regulations for cloud-based software? So the answer to that is no, there aren't. What I've just described are the standards. I guess you might argue that state of the art for cloud software has some different considerations that you need to think about. But I think still the same basic principles will apply. I guess it depends whether you're a cloud provider or whether you're providing a solution that runs on cloud software. I think if you're providing a solution that runs on cloud software, then what I've said this morning will apply. If you're a cloud provider, it's a bit different in that you're not really. And in fact, I can't immediately see why a cloud provider would be selling their product as a medical device. So I think these regulations really apply to people who are developing solutions that run on cloud, and I think the same regulations apply in that case. In effect, cloud is really just another way of delivering some hardware, and it obviously it disintermediates the developer from some of the hardware considerations. And the medical device regulations don't specifically talk about things like, shall we say, antivirus protection or cybersecurity more generally. I mean, you might address that as a risk. You might say, what if somebody hacked my solution and told people that were ill that they weren't ill, or whatever it might be. That might be, you might identify that as a potential risk, and then you might say that a mitigation for that risk is to put some cybersecurity prevention in place. And clearly, as a cloud-based solution, you might approach that in a different way than if you were either self-hosting or if you were on a standalone device on a mobile app on its own. But the short answer to your question is no. Basically, the same regulations apply.